The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly above the bustling chaos of Evergreen Mall. The air was thick with a medley of cinnamon, pine, and desperation as hordes of shoppers darted between aisles like frenzied ants. Holiday music blared from every corner. A sickly sweet tune looped endlessly, clawing its way into my ears. I hadn't intended to come out today. God knows not today, but I'd promised Emma. My little girl had circled the latest snowy sparkle unicorn in every catalog she could get her hands on, leaving subtle hints like crayon drawings taped to the fridge. I knew if I didn't find it tonight, Christmas morning would be a blur of disappointment and crocodile tears. Navigating through the throng, I dodged shopping bags swinging like wrecking balls and sidestepped sticky-fingered children chasing each other underfoot. A man in a sweat-drenched Santa costume sat on his gaudy throne near the food court, a garish red monstrosity decked in tinsel and glittering lights. Parents herded their kids into neat little lines, handing them over to the jolly giant with varying degrees of trust. His laugh rang out, deep, throaty, almost too real. Something about it made my stomach tighten, but I dismissed it as nothing more than my exhaustion playing tricks. In the center of the chaos stood Jake, the mall's night shift security guard, a towering figure clad in a stiff uniform. His face, lined with years of wear, was a map of quiet misery. I didn't know his story, just whispers among the regulars about his military past. Something about a loss he never spoke of. He didn't belong in this mess, and honestly neither did I. As I passed by the toy store, my heart sank. The shelves were ravaged, picked clean by the earlier crowds. I asked a frazzled employee if they had any more snowy sparkle unicorns in the back. She gave me a look, half pity, half apology, and shook her head. I lingered in the aisle, considering my next move. Maybe I could grab something else? But nothing would be the same for Emma. Above me, the PA system crackled to life. Attention shoppers, due to the incoming snowstorm, Evergreen Mall will be locking its doors at 9 p.m. for safety precautions. Please complete your purchases and prepare to leave shortly. Thank you and happy holidays. The announcement sent the crowd into overdrive, shoppers moving faster, grabbing more, their desperation palpable. The temperature inside seemed to rise with their panic. Outside, through the glass doors, I could see the storm worsening. Snow falling thick, sticking to the parking lot asphalt, where cars were slowly being buried. I debated leaving empty-handed when I heard Jake's voice, steady and commanding, over the commotion. All right, folks, keep it calm. Finish up and head to the exits. He moved through the throng, his presence a firm tether in the storm of holiday chaos. But the storm wasn't the only thing brewing. As the mall began to empty, I caught a glimpse of Santa rising from his throne, his sack slung over one broad shoulder. His gait was peculiar, purposeful. Something metallic glinted briefly from his hand before disappearing into the folds of his red sleeve. And just like that, the lights flickered. The mall was quieter now, but the stillness wasn't comforting. It felt like the moment before a scream. The holiday crowds had thinned to the desperate stragglers, the kind who believed one last lap around the shelves might summon a forgotten treasure. Above us, the speakers still droned that same cloying carol, now warped by static, as if the storm outside was seeping into everything. I didn't think much about the Santa switch at first. Word had spread quickly among the employees that the original Santa, the sweaty one with the unnerving laugh, had keeled over backstage. Rumor was he'd slipped on a spilled soda, smacked his head, and blacked out. Jake and another security guard had carried him out to a side office to wait for medical help, leaving us with the replacement Santa, who appeared almost too ready to step in. The new Santa looked the part in ways his predecessor never could. His suit was pristine, crimson velvet offset by stark white trim, as if it had been plucked straight from a department store display. The beard was convincing too, full, snowy, and perfectly combed, but it was his eyes that caught my attention. Most mall Santas have a tired, detached glaze, the kind that screams minimum wage and nowhere else to be. This guy's eyes burned like two shards of ice, bright and sharp, darting to every movement with an unsettling precision. I watched him take his seat, adjusting his sack of toys with a deliberateness that set my nerves alight. Parents nudged their kids forward reluctantly, their smiles strained, their enthusiasm forced. I couldn't blame them. Something about him was off, though I couldn't quite put my finger on what. From across the food court, I noticed Jake standing near the security kiosk, staring at one of the monitors. His brow furrowed, the deep lines on his face carving shadows beneath the harsh fluorescent light. Whatever he was watching had his full attention, his hand hovering over the walkie clipped to his chest. I pushed my cart closer to the escalator, watching Jake from the corner of my eye. He tapped a button on the console, cycling through camera feeds. Then he froze. His hand fell to his side, limp, as if the air had been sucked from him. Curiosity pulled at me, and I leaned against the railing to get a better view of the security desk. Jake's face had gone pale, his expression one of disbelief. No, more than that. It was dread. Before I could process the moment, the lights flickered again, plunging the mall into a murky dimness. The escalator beneath me groaned and shuddered to a halt. Shoppers glanced around, nervously clutching their bags tighter. And somewhere in the distance, a child began to wail. Jake swore under his breath, loud enough for me to catch, then grabbed his walkie and barked into it. "Control room, we've got a system malfunction. I'm losing the feeds. Do you copy?" Static answered him. Meanwhile, Santa had his arms wrapped around a little boy, his pristine gloves pressing just a bit too tightly into the child's small shoulders. The boy squirmed, his face twisted in discomfort, but the man only laughed, a low, guttural sound that felt more animal than human. The boy's mother stepped forward hesitantly. "All right, sweetie, let's go now." Santa tilted his head at her, his grin stretching unnaturally wide beneath his snowy beard. His voice, when it came, was silky and almost condescending. "What's the rush? Surely he has more wishes to share." The mother grabbed her son's hand, pulling him away with a nervous laugh. The boy's face was red, his eyes wet. He kept glancing back at Santa, as if trying to shake off the memory of whatever had just passed between them. Jake snapped back into motion, heading toward the Santa display with brisk, deliberate steps. But before he could get close, the lights flickered again, this time plunging us into near darkness. From somewhere nearby, I thought I heard the jingle of sleigh bells. The sound of Christmas was never meant to be this. I was in the toy store, clutching a doll in my hands, a fragile, frilly thing my daughter had begged for, her eyes lighting up every time the commercial played. The aisles were mostly empty now, the storm outside persuading even the most devoted shoppers to retreat home, I was debating between two colors, pink or purple, when I heard it. A muffled noise, like a scream choked halfway through its birth, barely audible over the canned holiday music trickling from the store's speakers. I froze, the doll still clutched in my fingers, my breath catching in my throat. It hadn't sounded close, more like it came from somewhere deeper in the mall. "Did you hear that?" I asked the teenage clerk behind the counter. He shrugged without looking up, too engrossed in whatever was playing on his phone. It came again, sharper this time, and closer. I shoved the doll into my cart and began walking toward the entrance of the store, my footsteps hesitant but compelled by something primal. My heart thudded in my chest, a heavy rhythm that seemed to sync with the flickering of the overhead lights. As I reached the edge of the store, a metallic tang hit my nostrils, sharp and sickly sweet. I stepped into the main concourse and froze. It took my brain a moment to process what I was seeing. At first glance, it could have passed as a macabre joke, some overzealous holiday decorator's idea of edgy. But as my eyes adjusted, I saw the truth. Above the entrance to the toy store, a figure hung by its neck, its limbs slack and grotesque in their unnatural angles. Blood, or what looked like blood, dripped lazily from its torso, pooling on the tiles below. I didn't recognize him at first, but as my eyes scanned the gaudy sweater and the toy store name tag, still clipped to his chest, I realized it was the clerk who'd been stocking shelves earlier. The noose wasn't a rope. It was a string of holiday lights, the bulbs now fractured and dark, digging deep into the flesh of his neck. Beneath him, a puddle of crimson reflected the glow of the mall's gaudy decorations. And in his chest, plunged with a kind of cruel artistry, was a sharpened candy cane, its once festive stripes now smeared in dark red. My stomach turned, but I couldn't look away. A movement in the corner of my vision snapped me back. It was him, the Santa. He stood at the far end of the corridor, his hulking frame silhouetted against the light from the food court. He wasn't looking at me. Instead, his gaze was fixed on his handiwork, his head tilted as though admiring a masterpiece. The pristine gloves he'd worn earlier were now stained, and in his hands he held a glinting blade shaped like a festive ornament. I stumbled backward, the soles of my boots sliding slightly in something sticky. The scream I'd been holding clawed its way up my throat, but I swallowed it back down, fear paralyzing me. Somewhere behind me, a bell chimed, a sound that should have been cheerful, but now felt like an omen. I turned and bolted, my cart abandoned, the doll forgotten. My footsteps echoed in the empty mall, louder than the carols still playing faintly overhead. As I ran, I caught snippets of other noises, shouts, crashes, the distinct echo of something heavy hitting the floor. And then the screaming began in earnest. The lights died with a final, pitiful flicker, leaving the mall in a suffocating gloom broken only by the pulsing glow of Christmas decorations. Strung along railings, fake furs, and window displays, the flickering bulbs seemed almost alive, their uneven rhythm more menacing than festive. I stood motionless in the shadows near a display of perfume gift sets, my breath catching in bursts of white mist. Somewhere in the distance, a crash echoed, sharp, metallic, followed by a faint, guttural sound that made my stomach lurch. I couldn't tell if it was human. A figure loomed into view, and I nearly screamed before I realized it was Jake, the security guard I'd seen earlier. His uniform looked disheveled, the sheen of sweat glistening on his brow. He held a flashlight in one hand, the beam jittering across the walls like a panicked heartbeat. "You okay?" His voice was low, urgent. I nodded, too shaken to speak. "Good. Stick close." He motioned for me to follow, and I did, drawn more by his confidence than any sense of safety. "What's going on?" I finally whispered, my voice trembling. "Storms knocked the power. Backup generator should have kicked in, but it didn't. And someone's jamming the emergency exits." Jamming? He shot me a look that said he didn't have time to explain. "Listen," he said, "we've got to get everyone out. But this isn't random. This guy knows what he's doing." The image of the toy store clerk's body flashed in my mind. The twisted holiday lights, the candy cane blade, calculated cruelty masquerading as merriment. Ahead of us, the faint glow of a Santa display bathed the corridor in a hellish red. The animatronic Santa in the chair twitched spasmodically. Its recorded "ho ho ho," now a distorted groan as its mechanism struggled against the blackout. "That sound," I murmured. "It's like a warning." Jake cut me off, his jaw tightening. We moved carefully through the concourse, Jake's flashlight illuminating fragments of the scene. An abandoned stroller, overturned merchandise, a smear of something dark trailing toward a shuttered jewelry store. The air felt thick, oppressive, as though the storm outside had crept in, bringing with it the cold weight of dread. "We'll head to the control room," Jake said. "Try to get the system back up and find out who's still inside." A scream cut through the air, sharp and sudden, then snuffed out just as quickly. My hand flew to my mouth to stifle the gasp that escaped. Jake turned, his face set like stone. "Stay close," he said again, his voice now tinged with urgency. We passed a display of oversized ornaments, their surfaces reflecting fractured glimpses of us as we crept along. My eyes darted to every shadow, every flicker of movement, my pulse hammering so loud I was sure it'd give us away. And then, without warning, a string of Christmas lights hanging overhead snapped, cascading down like a snare. Jake shoved me aside just in time, the lights missing me by inches as they hit the floor in a tangled mess of shattered bulbs and sparking wires. "Trap," Jake muttered under his breath. A laugh echoed from somewhere in the darkness, low, guttural, and filled with a chilling satisfaction. It wasn't the laughter of someone amused. It was the laughter of someone who knew they were winning. My legs felt weak, but Jake's hand on my arm kept me upright. "We're getting out of here," he said, his voice hardening. "And the others?" I asked, my throat dry. He didn't answer. Instead, he led me toward a side hallway. The flickering lights grew dimmer here, the decorations giving way to plain, utilitarian walls. "Control rooms this way," he said. But as we turned the corner, a grotesque tableau greeted us. A mannequin from one of the clothing stores, draped in a Santa suit, hanging upside down from the ceiling. Its head had been twisted to face us, and nestled in its outstretched hands was a gift-wrapped box. Jake's flashlight lingered on the box for a moment before he yanked me back. "Move," he said sharply. We retreated down the corridor, the eerie tableau fading into the dark behind us. "Who the hell does this?" I whispered. Jake didn't answer. His focus was ahead, his pace quickening. "Stay with me," he said again, and though his voice was steady, there was a tremor beneath it. I clung to his presence, the thin thread of logic and strength keeping me from unraveling completely. Whatever this nightmare was, it wasn't over. It had only just begun. The sounds of the mall had changed. No more festive music spilling from ceiling speakers. No rustling of shopping bags or impatient murmurs of last-minute customers. Now, there was only the brittle hum of the wind rattling against the building, punctuated by sharp, erratic noises. A muffled scream, the distant crunch of glass underfoot, and the occasional metallic clang that set my teeth on edge. Jake led the way, his flashlight carving out fragile pockets of light that barely held back the oppressive dark. I stayed close, my hand gripping the back of his jacket, as if letting go would send me tumbling into the abyss. We found the first body near the food court. It was a teenage employee, her green apron soaked and shiny under the flickering Christmas lights. Her head lolled unnaturally to one side, a strand of multicolored lights coiled around her neck like a garland of misery. The bulbs blinked cheerfully, a grotesque mockery of life, as though the killer had taken time to program them to flash in rhythm with some invisible, sinister beat. Jake crouched beside her, his lips pressed into a grim line. "He's using the decorations," he murmured. "This isn't random. He's planning. That word sank into me like ice. I looked away from the body, my stomach twisting. My gaze fell on a nearby table, where a row of shimmering ornaments sat in a decorative centerpiece. The closest one had been cracked open, its jagged edges glinting like a predator's grin. "He's turning everything into a weapon," I said, my voice barely audible. Jake stood abruptly, scanning the area. "We need to find anyone left and get them somewhere safe. Storage room, janitor's closet, anywhere with a lock." We moved deeper into the mall, the shadows feeling heavier with every step. The killer wasn't just hunting. He was toying with us, shaping the building into his own twisted playground. Near a pop-up toy store, the carnage became worse. A trail of smeared crimson led to a display of teddy bears, their fur matted and darkened. A carousel horse lay toppled, its painted eyes staring blankly at the ceiling, as if bearing witness to the horror. And then I saw the second body. A man this time, one of the mall's janitors. His hands were still clutching at the strands of tinsel embedded in his throat, the glittering threads cutting deep into flesh. Above him, dangling from the overhang, were more ornaments, these sharpened and tied together into a deadly garrote. Jake muttered something under his breath that I didn't catch. He stepped forward, but I grabbed his arm. "Don't," I hissed. "It could be a trap." He hesitated, the beam of his flashlight sweeping across the scene. The light caught on something else, a trail of small, red footprints leading away from the body. Child-sized. My heart stopped. "No," I whispered, the word tumbling out involuntarily. Jake followed my gaze, his expression hardening. "They're not real," he said quickly, trying to calm me. He's setting the scene. It's a game to him." But I wasn't so sure. We continued down the corridor, every nerve in my body screaming at me to run. The killer was ahead of us, somewhere, but it felt like he was everywhere at once. The holiday decorations seemed to come alive in his hands, transformed into instruments of suffering. At the entrance to a high-end clothing store, we found another gruesome display. A mannequin had been dressed in an elf costume, its hands replaced with jagged shards of broken glass. Pinned to its chest was a note, scrawled in looping letters. "Do you like my gifts? More to come." Jake snatched the note and crumpled it in his fist. His jaw was set tight, but I could see the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "This guy knows the layout too well," he said. "He's not just some psycho off the street. He knows the mall, every inch of it." "What are you saying?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. Jake's gaze darted to the shadows. "I'm saying this isn't his first time here. He's familiar with the place, with the people, maybe even with us." The idea sent a cold spike of fear through me. The killer wasn't just using the mall. He was orchestrating it, bending it to his will. We pressed on, the air growing heavier with each discovery. The killer's trail was becoming more elaborate, his methods more twisted. A Christmas tree strung with razor-edged ornaments, stockings stuffed with jagged scraps of metal. Even the oversized candy canes lining the main concourse had been shattered into shards sharp enough to pierce flesh. And yet, through all of it, there was an eerie, calculated silence. The screams had stopped. The killer was isolating us, driving us towards some unseen endgame. Jake and I stumbled into a small electronics store, the display screens casting ghostly reflections of us in the dark. He motioned for me to stay low as he scanned the area. I crouched behind a counter, my fingers trembling as I gripped a makeshift weapon, a broken piece of shelving I'd picked up along the way. "We'll find him," Jake said quietly, "and we'll stop him." But as the silence deepened, I couldn't help but wonder, was he finding us first? The air in the abandoned office reeked of stale coffee and damp carpet, a grim echo of the lives lived in its confines. Now, it was something else entirely, a shrine to madness, dressed in the colors of the season. The room was lit by a single, flickering emergency light, casting long shadows over piles of clutter that had been arranged with disturbing precision. In the center of it all sat an enormous red Santa sack, bulging ominously like it had devoured the secrets of 100 sins. Jake approached it cautiously, his flashlight held like a weapon. I stayed back, the walls of the tiny room pressing in around me. It felt wrong being here, as if we'd stepped inside the killer's mind, and it was suffocating us one thought at a time. "Stay by the door," Jake muttered, his voice tight. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. My eyes roamed the room, taking in the bizarre tableau. There were photos taped to the walls, snapshots of smiling families posing with Santa, their joy now framed by jagged handwriting scrawled across the images. Liars, fakes, unworthy. Underneath the photos were scraps of paper, receipts, and official documents that looked like they'd been stolen straight from the mall office. There was even a faded flyer for a Santa Claus audition, the corners curling like the edges of old parchment. Jake crouched beside the red sack, his hands steady despite the tremor in his voice. "I'm opening it, Jake. Maybe we shouldn't." But he'd already pulled the drawstring loose. The contents spilled out like entrails, tumbling onto the floor in a grotesque display. There were scraps of costumes, shredded red velvet, and faux fur trims stained dark with something I didn't want to identify. Mixed among the fabric were children's toys, smashed beyond recognition, and plastic reindeer figurines with their eyes gouged out. And then, the papers. Jake picked one up, his brow furrowing as he read. "It's a rejection letter." I stepped closer, my morbid curiosity outweighing my fear. The letter was formal, stamped with the mall's logo, and addressed to a name I didn't recognize. Martin Caldwell. Thank you for your interest in becoming Santa for Pinecrest Mall. Jake read aloud, his tone growing darker with each word. Unfortunately, we've chosen to proceed with another candidate. We appreciate your enthusiasm and wish you the best of luck in your future endeavors. I stared at the letter, the words sharp and cold even on paper. Beneath it were more documents. An application form scribbled in the same jagged handwriting as the photos, a rejection notice for another mall, and what looked like fragments of a resume. He wanted this, I said quietly, to be Santa. It wasn't just a job to him. It was something more. Jake nodded grimly, flipping through the pile. There's more. The next sheet wasn't from the mall. It was a yellow piece of notebook paper, its edges frayed, covered in childlike scrawl. I leaned in, the words burning themselves into my mind. Dear Santa, please make them stop laughing at me. I just want one Christmas where I'm not the joke. I'll be good. I promise. The writing shifted halfway down the page, becoming shakier, angrier. You didn't come. You never come. You're a lie, just like everyone else. A chill ran down my spine. It's his, I whispered. From when he was a kid. Jake dropped the page onto the pile and picked up a small box that had tumbled from the sack. It was wrapped in cheap red foil, tied with a ragged green ribbon. He unwrapped it carefully, revealing a cracked snow globe. Inside, instead of a peaceful holiday scene, there was a crude diorama of a boy being pelted with tiny red beads, his face painted in a permanent expression of terror. His Christmases weren't like anyone else's, Jake muttered. This isn't just revenge on the mall. It's revenge on Christmas itself. I felt my throat tighten as I looked around the room. The killer's rage was everywhere, embedded in every piece of tinsel, every photo defaced with black ink. This wasn't just a spree, it was a mission. Jake, I said, my voice trembling, he's not going to stop. Not until he's finished. Jake stood, his jaw set. Then we stop him first. But as the words left his mouth, the emergency light flickered again, plunging the room into brief darkness. When it buzzed back to life, the sack lay empty, its contents strewn across the floor like the aftermath of a storm. And on the wall, written in something wet and dark, were the words, I've been watching you, too. The mall felt alive in the worst way possible, its festive decorations taking on a sinister sentience, like they were rooting for the chaos unfolding within. Somewhere in its cavernous belly, the killer moved unseen, slipping between the aisles and displays like a shadow too dense for the light. Jake and I were left scrambling, trying to outwit a man who seemed to have thought of everything. Jake knelt beside a toppled display of fake snow, his hands moving with feverish determination. He was rigging a string of Christmas lights into something that looked like a snare, looping the wire tightly around the base of a support column. The multicolored bulbs blinked in rhythm, casting frantic hues across his face. This has to work, he muttered almost to himself. It has to. I didn't answer. I was too busy trying to balance a makeshift tripwire between two oversized candy canes we'd wrestled from a storefront. Every move felt like a gamble, every moment stretching thinner and thinner under the weight of our desperation. Do you think he knows? I asked finally, my voice a low rasp. Jake didn't look up. He knows everything. But we're not giving him the upper hand. The plan, or what we dared call a plan, was simple. Draw him into the center of the mall where the garish Christmas tree still stood proud and blinking, and trap him using whatever scraps of holiday cheer we could weaponize. Strings of tinsel lined the floor like razor wire, their edges glinting sharp under the emergency lights. Broken ornaments were scattered like caltrops. It was improvised, sloppy, and entirely dependent on the whims of luck. "Where's Martin?" I asked, glancing toward the security guard who had been lurking nervously in the shadows. Jake's hand stilled for a moment. He's agreed to act as bait. I froze, my breath catching. "You what?" "It's the only way," Jake snapped, standing to face me. His eyes were hard, guilt swimming just beneath their surface. He volunteered. He said he'd do whatever it takes to end this. I wanted to argue, to scream at the insanity of putting another life on the line, but I knew it would be useless. Martin had looked terrified from the moment the power went out. Yet beneath that fear was something resolute, a grim acceptance of the role he'd play in this nightmare. Before I could press further, Martin's voice echoed through the mall. He was standing near the tree, his flashlight a feeble beam against the oppressive darkness. "Hey, Santa," he called, his voice cracking. "You want me? Come and get me." The words bounced off the walls, swallowed almost immediately by the oppressive quiet. Jake and I ducked behind a toppled kiosk, our eyes locked on the scene ahead. Seconds ticked by like hours. The only sound was the hum of the emergency lights and the occasional creak of the building settling under the storm's weight. And then he appeared. The killer stepped out from behind a display of animatronic reindeer, his Santa suit a grotesque patchwork of red and white smeared with dried blood. He held a candy cane in one hand, its jagged edge glinting like a blade. Martin froze, his flashlight trembling. "Stay back," he whispered, though it was more a plea than a command. Jake tensed beside me, his hand hovering over the cord of the light trap. "Just a little closer," he murmured. But the killer didn't step into the trap. Instead, he moved with a terrifying calm, circling Martin like a predator savoring its prey. His gaze darted toward the blinking lights, the scattered tinsel, the broken ornaments. He knew. Before Jake could act, the killer lunged. The candy cane plunged into Martin's throat with a sickening crunch, and his scream was cut short as blood sprayed in a grotesque arc. The killer didn't stop there. He hoisted Martin's lifeless body onto the Christmas tree, impaling him on the metal frame like a grotesque angel. I stifled a gasp, my hands gripping the edge of the kiosk, so tightly I thought it would snap. Jake's face was pale, his jaw clenched in silent rage. He knew, I whispered, the words barely audible. He saw through everything. The killer turned, his eyes locking onto ours, as if he could see us through the shadows. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. And then he smiled. It was a smile that spoke of triumph, of power, of a game where he held all the cards. He raised a gloved hand, waving it in a mockery of holiday cheer before disappearing back into the darkness. Jake slumped against the kiosk, his composure cracking. "We failed," he muttered, his voice hollow. "We're just giving him what he wants." I didn't know what to say. The mall felt colder now, as if the killer's presence had drained the last vestiges of warmth from the air. But one thing was clear. This wasn't just a fight for survival anymore. It was a war against a force that thrived on fear, and we were hopelessly outmatched. The air in the mall was thick with dread, the kind that clung to your lungs and made breathing feel like a punishment. Somewhere in the guttural dark, the killer had gathered his audience. We followed the sounds, muffled cries, the scrape of something heavy being dragged, and a low, off-key rendition of Jingle Bells that made my stomach churn. Jake and I moved like shadows, every step an agony of hesitation. He gripped a broken piece of a candy cane, sharpened to a point, while I held a fire extinguisher like a talisman. The killer's voice broke the silence, syrupy and lilting, dripping with false cheer. Welcome one and all to Santa's naughty list extravaganza. We edged closer, peering from behind the ruins of a toy store display. The food court had become a stage for his madness. Tables were overturned, forming crude barriers. For survivors sat bound with tinsel and strings of blinking lights, their faces pale and tear-streaked. In the center, the killer stood like a demented maestro, his blood-stained Santa suit now adorned with bows and scraps of gift wrap. Now, he chided, pacing before his captives. No need to be shy. This is a safe space. Santa just wants to hear the truth. Let's start with you, sweetheart. He crouched before a young woman, her trembling lips betraying the scream she was too terrified to let out. He tilted her chin up with the jagged edge of a candy cane. What's your Christmas sin? Did you lie to your parents? Maybe you stole a little something from under the tree? Come on, tell Santa. Her voice cracked as she stammered. I took money from my sister's purse last Christmas. I needed it for rent. The killer's grin widened, and he clapped his hands, the sound echoing in the eerie stillness. Ah, greed, a classic. Santa loves greed. The man beside her, a wiry older gentleman with a bloodied forehead, spoke up, his voice hoarse and desperate. You're sick. Let her go. Let all of us go. The killer turned to him, his expression dropping into something darker, colder. Interrupting Santa's game? That's a naughty, naughty thing to do. In one swift motion, he pulled a strand of Christmas lights taut around the man's neck, tightening it until his struggles became spasms, then stillness. He let the body slump to the floor like a discarded toy. I felt Jake stiffen beside me, his grip tightening on his makeshift weapon. We need to move, he whispered, his voice barely audible. But I wasn't ready. My limbs felt anchored, my pulse roaring in my ears as I watched the killer pivot back to his remaining captives, his manic energy undeterred. All right, next up. He turned to a young man in a holiday sweater now soaked with sweat. What's your sin, Rudolph? Jake nudged me, his voice cutting through the fog of my fear. Lily, now. We crept closer, using the overturned tables for cover. My heart was a drumbeat of terror, every step a gamble against the killer's razor-sharp instincts. The young man was sobbing now, his words tumbling out in a frantic confession. I lied to my wife. I told her I was working overtime, but I was with someone else. Please, I'm sorry. The killer tilted his head, considering. Adultery? TSK. Not very jolly of you. Jake lunged before the killer could make his move, the sharpened candy cane flashing in the dim light. It missed its mark, grazing the killer's arm but drawing blood. The man roared, spinning to face us, his eyes alight with rage and something more primal. Interrupting Santa's fun, he snarled, raising the bloodied strand of lights like a whip. How very naughty of you. The room erupted into chaos. Jake charged again, wrestling with the killer, as I scrambled to free the hostages. My fingers fumbled with the knotted tinsel, my breath ragged as panic clawed at my chest. "Hurry, Lily," Jake shouted, his voice strained as he grappled with the maniac. One by one, I freed the survivors, ushering them toward the darkened corridors of the mall. But the killer was relentless, his laughter a chilling counterpoint to the struggle. He slammed Jake against a counter, his strength almost inhuman. I didn't think. I grabbed the fire extinguisher and swung it with everything I had, the impact reverberating up my arms as it connected with the back of the killer's head. He staggered, momentarily dazed. "Jake, go," I screamed, pulling him to his feet. We fled into the labyrinth of the mall, the killer's laughter echoing behind us. It wasn't over, not by a long shot, but for now we had a chance. And in this twisted game, a chance was all we could ask for. The mall's oppressive silence was shattered by the sound of our footfalls, echoing like a heartbeat through the darkened corridors. The air smelled of melted plastic and fear, the faint scent of blood still clinging to the festive decorations. Jake and I led the group of survivors, moving with cautious urgency, their breaths ragged whispers behind us. Every shadow felt like a threat, every flicker of the failing lights a promise of doom. The food court loomed ahead, a battlefield of overturned chairs and sticky floors. We needed to regroup to find something, anything, that could buy us time. Jake's face was set with determination, his jaw clenched against the growing panic. But even he couldn't hide the exhaustion dragging at his steps. "Over there," he whispered, pointing to an employee-only door near the soft glow of a neon pretzel sign. We herded the survivors inside, shutting the door behind us. The cramped storage room smelled of stale dough and cleaning supplies, but it felt like a haven compared to the chaos outside. As Jake searched for supplies, anything that could serve as a weapon, I noticed one of the survivors, a wiry man with darting eyes and sweat gleaming on his temples, fidgeting near the door. His name was Andy, and he'd been on edge since we freed him. "We need to keep moving," Andy hissed, his voice a sharp contrast to the muted tension in the room. "Staying here is suicide. He'll find us." Jake glanced over, his voice calm but firm. "And running out there blind is a death sentence. We stick together." Andy's hands clenched into fists. "Stick together? That lunatic doesn't care if we're a group or scattered. He's picking us off one by one. I'm not dying for your half-baked plans." The tension crackled like static. I stepped closer, my voice low. "No one's dying, Andy. Just stay with us. We'll figure this out." His eyes met mine, and for a moment I thought I saw a flicker of guilt, or maybe something darker. He looked away, muttering under his breath. We didn't have time to dissect his mood. A sudden crash outside the door sent us all into a frozen panic. Jake motioned for silence, his grip tightening on a broken broom handle. But before we could react, Andy moved. In one fluid motion, he opened the door and bolted, leaving it ajar. "Andy," I hissed, but it was too late. The air in the room turned frigid as we realized the door had become a beacon. The killer's boots echoed through the hallway, heavy and deliberate. Jake swore under his breath, shoving a metal rack against the door just as it burst open, the force sending us stumbling backward. The killer stood there, a silhouette of chaos framed by the blinking lights of the corridor. His Santa suit was drenched in blood, his twisted smile illuminated by the faint glow of his weapon. A string of Christmas lights coiled like a serpent in his gloved hand. "Looks like someone's been naughty," he purred, his voice oozing mockery. We scattered, bursting out of the room and into the open expanse of the food court. The killer gave chase, his laughter bouncing off the walls. Andy's betrayal had turned the hunt into a frenzy, the predator closing in with the glee of someone who knew the terrain better than his prey. Jake grabbed my hand, pulling me behind an overturned table. The others darted in different directions, their screams piercing the air as the killer's footsteps grew louder. A strangled cry cut through the chaos. "Andy!" I didn't dare look, but the sound of shattering glass and a body hitting the floor told me all I needed to know. The killer wasn't far. Jake and I crouched low, our breathing shallow. He held the broom handle like a lifeline, his knuckles white. "On my count," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "We run to the next exit. Stay close." I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. 1, 2. The killer's laughter erupted behind us, and before Jake could say 3, we were running, our steps frantic against the sticky tile floor. He was close, so close I could feel the air shift with every swing of his improvised weapon. We reached the central kiosk, its fake snow and garland mocking us with their festivity. Jake turned, swinging the broom handle with all his strength. It connected with the killer's arm, and for a moment, the sound of impact was a symphony of resistance. But the killer was faster, stronger. He lashed out with the string of lights, the bulb shattering as they wrapped around Jake's arm, slicing into his skin. Jake gritted his teeth, using the pain to fuel another attack. "Run, Lily!" he shouted, his voice raw. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to stay, to fight. But Jake's eyes met mine, and in them, I saw a command, a promise. I turned and ran, his voice fading behind me as the killer's laughter grew louder. The air in the mall was no longer cold. It burned, a thick miasma of sweat, blood, and the artificial cinnamon pumped through the vents. The holiday cheer had curdled into something sickly, like old eggnog left out to rot. Jake's breath came in ragged gasps, each exhale punctuated by the muffled groans of the wounded survivors huddled in the shadows behind Lily. The killer stood before him, illuminated by the erratic glow of a shattered neon Santa's Workshop sign. His Santa suit was no longer red by design. It was soaked, the fabric clinging to his wiry frame like a grotesque second skin. His eyes burned brighter than the lights tangled around his arms, shards of glass glinting like jagged stars. Jake tightened his grip on the broom handle, now more splinters than weapon. Blood dripped from his arm, pooling on the tiled floor beneath him. He felt the pain, sharp and searing, but it was nothing compared to the weight of Lily's gaze from across the room. The killer laughed, a guttural sound, equal parts madness and joy. "You've been brave," he said, his voice syrupy and mocking. "But bravery only gets you so far, little boy. Stop talking and fight." Jake spat, his voice hoarse. The killer tilted his head, his grin widening. "As you wish." He lunged faster than Jake had anticipated. The Christmas lights whipped through the air like a serpent, their broken edges slicing at Jake's side. He stumbled but kept his footing, swinging the broom handle with all the force he could muster. It connected with the killer's ribs, the crack of wood and bone reverberating through the cavernous food court. But the killer barely flinched. He grabbed the handle, yanking it from Jake's hands and tossing it aside like a discarded toy. "Is that all you've got?" the killer sneered, circling Jake like a predator savoring its kill. Jake clenched his fists, the pain in his body a distant hum compared to the adrenaline coursing through him. He charged, slamming his shoulder into the killer's chest, driving him back into a pile of toppled chairs. They crashed to the ground in a heap of tangled limbs and shattered plastic. Lily watched from her hiding spot, her fingers digging into the fabric of her jeans. The survivors around her were silent, their fear a palpable weight pressing against her chest. She wanted to help, to run to Jake's side, but she knew she couldn't leave them. The killer recovered quickly, shoving Jake off him with a strength that didn't seem human. He grabbed a jagged piece of a broken tray from the ground, wielding it like a blade. "You're persistent," he said, his tone almost admiring. "But persistence won't save you." Jake dodged the first swipe, the second, but the third caught his shoulder. He cried out, the tray slicing through his jacket and into flesh. Blood blossomed against the fabric, warm and sticky. But Jake didn't stop. He grabbed a chair leg from the debris and swung it upward, catching the killer under the chin. The impact sent the killer staggering, his Santa hat flying off to reveal matted hair and a twisted scar running along his temple. "Not so jolly now, are you?" Jake growled, his voice shaking with effort. The killer roared, charging at Jake with all his weight. They collided, tumbling across the floor in a violent dance of fists and blood. Across the room, Lily's eyes darted to the chaos. She saw Jake's face contorted in pain and determination, and knew she couldn't wait any longer. She grabbed a discarded fire extinguisher, its red paint gleaming like a beacon, and sprinted toward the fight. The killer had pinned Jake, his hands around his throat, squeezing the life out of him. Jake clawed at his arms, his vision blurring, the edges of the world darkening. "Hey, Santa," Lily's voice cut through the haze. The killer turned, just in time to see the fire extinguisher swing toward his head. The impact was brutal, the sound of metal on bone echoing like a church bell. The killer toppled sideways, blood streaming from his temple. Jake coughed, gasping for air as Lily helped him to his feet. "You okay?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Not yet," Jake rasped, his gaze locked on the killer's prone form. He stumbled toward him, grabbing the string of Christmas lights still tangled around the killer's arms. With a grim determination, he wrapped them tighter, pulling until the lights bit into flesh. The killer's eyes fluttered open, and for a moment there was fear. Real, human fear. "Merry Christmas," Jake whispered, his voice cold. The lights sparked, the exposed wires catching on the killer's blood-soaked suit. Flames licked at the fabric, consuming him as his screams filled the air. Lily turned away, pulling the survivors with her as the fire grew, the glow of it casting grotesque shadows across the walls. Jake stood there for a moment longer, watching as the killer burned, the scent of charred fabric and flesh mixing with the acrid smell of the extinguished fire. When he finally turned, Lily was there, her hand outstretched. "Let's go," she said softly. Jake nodded, taking her hand. Together, they led the survivors toward the mall's emergency exit, the glow of the flames fading behind them. The snow fell in thin, dense curtains, like the veil of a funeral. The wind sliced through the air, and the silence of the outside world felt more oppressive than any scream or wail they might have heard. Jake and Lily led the way, every step they took echoing like a death knell, the faint glow of the Christmas lights still flickering like a lost beacon. The weight of horror seemed to have dissolved into the air, but something else lingered now, something even more terrifying. The sensation of being watched, of being observed. Is it over, Jake?" Lily whispered, her voice cutting through the stillness. Jake didn't answer immediately. He kept moving, eyes scanning the darkened hallways, the flickering lights casting shadows that danced like twisted phantoms. He wanted to believe it was over, wanted to believe that the nightmare had finally ended, but the dread in his gut told him otherwise. The storm had locked them inside like rats in a cage. The exit doors, once their only hope, were now nothing but thick sheets of ice, their handles frozen solid. They had tried everything, pounding, kicking, desperate prayers against the relentless winter. But nothing worked. They were trapped. Lily had been silent for too long, and Jake finally turned to her, his expression hardening. "We can't stay here," he muttered, scanning the shadows around them. "We have to keep moving. Find another way out." Lily nodded, but Jake could see the doubt in her eyes. The coldness that had crept into her gaze was no longer just from the storm. They rounded a corner near the food court, and that's when Jake saw it, the unmistakable shape of something moving in the shadows. It was him, the Santa Claus, the bastard who had nearly killed them all. He was still alive. Jake's heart pounded in his chest. He grabbed Lily's arm and pulled her into a small alcove, pressing them both against the wall, their breaths coming out in clouds. They didn't speak. There was no need. They could hear him. The sound of his boots scraping against the tile, slow and deliberate. The way the breath rattled from his chest. Too loud, too ragged. It was clear now that he wasn't just a man anymore. He was something monstrous, something hungry. The faint glow from the Christmas lights above flickered once more. Then there was silence. Jake's grip on Lily tightened, and then crack. The sound was sharp, sudden, and unmistakable. The sickening sound of bones snapping. The faintest scream followed, a sound that was cut short, as though someone had been choked mid-wail. "Lily," Jake whispered, his voice low, straining. "Stay here. Don't move." But Lily didn't nod. She didn't speak. She only looked at him with a strange understanding in her eyes, and Jake realized in that instant that she knew as well as he did. There was no safe place now. Not anymore. The hunt was far from over. They moved cautiously, silently, inching around the corner of the corridor. The food court was ahead, its bright neon signs dimming and flickering, as if they too were aware of the madness that had gripped the place. Jake paused for a moment, eyes narrowing as he peered into the food court. There, at the far end of the empty hall, he saw the figure standing in the shadows, Santa. His red suit was stained, his jolly face twisted with something darker now. His gloved hands were empty. No longer the harmless, festive man they had once seen. He was something else, something that could only be described as pure terror. The bastard had been waiting for them. Jake's blood ran cold. He was back, and this time he wasn't alone. As if sensing their presence, Santa's head snapped around, those cold, hollow eyes locking onto Jake's with an intensity that made his stomach turn. A smile, a grotesque, twisted smile, spread across Santa's face, and in that moment Jake knew they weren't just being hunted anymore. They were the prey, trapped in his world of terror. The last snow outside, soft and gentle, continued to fall, but the storm inside the mall, the one they couldn't escape, had only just begun. "Run," Jake said, barely a breath escaping his lips. And they did, but the chase was on. The air was thick with the weight of inevitability. The snow, once delicate and pure, now fell in heavy, oppressive sheets, covering the world outside like a tomb. The wind howled, twisting through the ruins of the mall, carrying the scent of decay, of burned Christmas trees and blood, into the stillness. Jake had always been a man of action, always the one to take charge. But in the face of what was happening now, he found himself paralyzed by a single, brutal truth. This wasn't just a nightmare anymore. It was real. And if he wanted to stop the madness, if he wanted to save Lily and the last of the children, he had to make a choice. The sounds of footsteps echoed through the hallways, growing louder, closer. Santa Claus. No, the Santa was coming. His labored breathing, punctuated by those sickening, guttural laughs, reverberated off the cracked glass and shattered tiles. The lights above flickered one last time, then went dark, plunging them all into shadow. Lily was holding the children. 4 of them now, the others long lost to the carnage. She huddled them close, whispering words of comfort, even though they all knew that their only hope lay in one last act of defiance. Jake moved toward the heart of the mall, where the final confrontation awaited. The weight of the explosives in his pack felt like a curse, each step making it heavier, more real. He knew what needed to be done. He had seen the bombs before, the traps the killer had set, all too familiar now. If he detonated the explosives in the right place, if he could just destroy the heart of the shopping center. The walls, once festive and bright, were now empty, eerily silent. No children laughing, no shoppers bustling. Just the cold hum of the storm and the distant echo of Santa's footsteps dragging across the debris. Jake. Lily's voice cut through the quiet. He turned to find her standing in the corridor, her eyes wide with fear, holding the youngest child, a little girl barely old enough to understand what was happening. "You don't have to do this." Her voice trembled. She reached out, her hand shaking. "We can still run. We can still hide." But Jake only shook his head. There was no running anymore. He walked toward her, his movements slow but purposeful. His hands trembled as he placed a kiss on the little girl's forehead. He didn't know if he'd make it out. He didn't even know if Lily and the kids would. But he knew one thing for sure. If he didn't do this, if he didn't end it now, there would be no tomorrow. "Promise me," he said, his voice breaking. "Promise me you'll get them out. Get them away from this place." Lily's lips parted, but she said nothing, her eyes filled with tears that reflected the faint glow of the Christmas lights. Jake didn't wait for an answer. He turned and disappeared into the shadows of the central atrium, the heart of the mall, where it would all end. As he entered the open space, he saw the figure of Santa standing near the remains of a Christmas tree, the twisted red and green lights flickering above his head like the last vestiges of hope. He was waiting, that sickening smile still stretched across his face, the madness in his eyes undeniable. "You think you can stop me?" Santa rasped, his voice harsh and broken. "You think you can kill me? This is my season. My holiday." Jake didn't speak. He didn't need to. His hand went to the detonator. The moment his finger touched the button, The world seemed to stop, as if the snow outside had frozen time itself. But as he pressed it, there was no explosion, no flash of light, no glorious end. Instead, there was only the click, a sound so small, so insignificant that for a moment, Jake thought he had failed. He heard Santa laugh, low and cruel, and the sound made his skin crawl. But then, boom, the explosion rocked the entire mall. The shock wave slammed into Jake's chest, throwing him to the ground as walls crumbled around him. The floor buckled, and the lights shattered in a cascade of sparks, illuminating the chaos in flashes of red and yellow. For a brief moment, everything was consumed by fire. The blast wave pushed Jake backward, but he held on to the detonator. He could hear the rubble collapsing, the screams of Santa echoing through the wreckage. It wasn't enough to stop him. Jake's world blurred as the debris piled over him. His breath came in short, panicked gasps, and the world around him dissolved into noise and fire. The mall was collapsing. But in the distance, through the haze of smoke and falling ash, Jake heard Lily's voice, faint but real. Jake. Then there was silence. Lily stood at the entrance, the children by her side, their faces wide with fear but alive. The storm raged on, snow swirling around them in violent gusts, but they were free. As she turned to leave, she glanced back one last time, just in time to see the glowing red of a Christmas sack lying untouched in the snow outside. Its empty shape still whole, still pristine. She swallowed hard and took her daughter's hand. For the first time, Lily was certain of one thing. The terror might have ended tonight, but the shadows it cast would never leave.